What happened in the waters around Iran was not just another exchange of fire. It was the moment this crisis stopped looking like a contained regional showdown and started looking like a maritime shock, powerful enough to hit war planning, energy markets, and global shipping all at once. Reuters reported that a U.S. submarine sank the Iranian frigate IRIS Dena off southern Sri Lanka, while the wider U.S. Iran conflict was already choking traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, the single most important oil choke point on the planet. That is why this story matters so much. One Iranian warship going down is already a major escalation. But the bigger issue is where this happened, when it happened, and what was unfolding around it at the same time. Reuters said the Dena sank about 19 nautical miles off the southern port city of Gala, inside Sri Lanka's exclusive economic zone, after coming under attack from a U.S. submarine while returning from a naval exercise in India held from February 16 to February 26. And the human toll was severe. Reuters reported that dozens of Iranian sailors were killed, while Sri Lankan authorities moved to rescue survivors and later offloaded 208 crew members from a second Iranian vessel, the naval auxiliary Bushehr, which had become stranded nearby after the attack on Dena. That alone tells you this was not a pinprick strike or a symbolic warning shot. This was a battlefield event with immediate operational consequences at sea. But the warship sinking is only the front edge of the story. The larger picture is that the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that carries about 20% of globally traded oil and LNG, has been thrown into severe disruption. More than 200 ships stranded and many more unable to enter Gulf ports as the conflict widened. When that choke point starts to fail, every navy, every insurer, every refinery, and every government watching energy prices instantly understands that this is no longer just about Iran and the United States. The market reaction shows exactly how serious that is. The Financial Times reported that shipping insurance costs in the Gulf have surged as much as 1-2-fold, with war risk premiums jumping from about 0.25% of a ship's value to as much as 3%, even after Washington floated guarantees and support measures. In other words, even before you count missiles, drones, or naval escorts, the conflict is already imposing a brutal financial tax on anyone trying to move cargo through the region. And once commercial shipping starts freezing up, military choices get narrower and more dangerous. Reuters reported that France is now deploying nearly 12 naval vessels, including the aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle, into the eastern Mediterranean and nearby waters, as European powers try to protect maritime security and freedom of navigation. That is a major signal, because it means the military map is expanding outward from the Gulf itself and drawing more outside powers into the same crisis zone. So this is the real headline we need to keep in mind as we move deeper into the story. The sinking of IRIS Dena was not just a dramatic tactical loss for Iran. It was proof that this war is now hitting the sea lanes, the insurance market, the energy system, and the naval balance of the wider region all at once, which is exactly why the next phase may be even more dangerous than the strike itself. If the sinking of Dena was the opening shock, then the Strait of Hormuz is where this crisis becomes impossible to ignore. This was not just another exchange of fire in a narrow waterway, because once Iranian vessels started burning near their own coastline while commercial shipping was already slowing down, the meaning of the battle changed immediately. Iran was no longer just losing ships. It was starting to lose control in the one maritime corridor it can least afford to lose. That is what makes the losses around Hormuz so serious. Another Iranian vessel was seen burning near Qeshm, and a confirmed strike also hit the Shahid Sayyad Shirazi, a Soleimani-class corvette, with footage showing the catamaran hull and the superstructure engulfed in flames. These were not symbolic targets. These fast missile corvettes were meant to be part of Iran's asymmetric naval posture in the Gulf. The exact kind of platforms designed to pressure shipping, threaten larger fleets, and make the water around Hormuz far more dangerous. The problem for Iran is that these are not losses it can easily shrug off. The Soleimani class was never a large fleet, so when multiple hulls from a limited class start getting destroyed, damaged, or knocked out of action, the story stops being about a single strike and becomes about fleet erosion. A navy can absorb isolated damage, But once scarce platforms start disappearing faster than they can be replaced, every surviving ship becomes harder to risk and more painful to lose. And this is where the Hormuz story becomes much bigger than naval combat. Tanker traffic through the strait had reportedly dropped by 92%, an extraordinary number for a choke point that sits at the center of global energy flows. Once traffic falls that sharply, the damage is no longer confined to warships and coastlines, because the effects immediately spill into insurance, freight pricing, refinery planning, and fuel costs far beyond the Middle East. That is why Washington's warning matters. As Marco Rubio put it, if they do that, it will be another terrible mistake. It's economic suicide for them if they do it. That line captures the core of the Hormuz crisis perfectly, because shutting down or even semi-paralyzing this corridor does not just hurt Iran's enemies. It also threatens to blow up the very economic space Iran itself would need to survive a prolonged conflict. The commercial danger was already becoming obvious. A container ship near Oman was reportedly hit above the waterline, causing a fire in the engine room and leaving the vessel stranded. Once merchant crews and shipping companies believe the transit lane itself has become a live fire zone, the whole system begins slowing down even before any formal closure is announced. And hanging over all of this is an even harder political signal from Washington. Donald Trump's demand for unconditional surrender shows just how far this confrontation has already moved beyond signaling and limited retaliation. Once language like that enters the conflict, every burning ship and every disrupted tanker route starts to look less like a temporary spike in tension and more like the opening stage of a campaign neither side can easily stop. That is why the fighting in Hormuz cannot be dismissed as a local naval clash. What is unfolding there is a layered crisis, with Iranian ships burning near the coast, commercial shipping under threat, and the world's most important energy artery tightening by the hour. Once all of that starts happening at the same time, the battle stops being about a few miles of water and starts becoming a test of who can endure the military and economic pressure that follows. If Hormuz shows how this war is choking trade, then the strikes inside Iran show how Washington and its partners are trying to choke Iran's ability to keep fighting at all. This is where the conflict stops, looking like a maritime crisis, and starts looking like a systematic effort to strip away launchers, radar coverage, command vehicles, and the support systems that keep missile and drone attacks alive. The goal is no longer just to hit Iran hard. The goal is to reduce what Iran can still launch tomorrow. That is exactly why the strikes on transporter erector launchers matter so much. In the core story, launchers near Shiraz are hit while preparing to fire. Support vehicles are destroyed beside them. And even older air defense systems are shown being taken out on camera. Militarily, that matters because missile warfare is not just about how many missiles a country owns. It is about how many launchers survive, how many crews remain coordinated, how many radar systems are still functioning, and whether the side under pressure can keep up a meaningful tempo of fire after repeated losses. Reuters has reported that Iranian missile launches dropped sharply after the opening phase of the war, with U.S. and Israeli officials attributing part of that decline to strikes on launch infrastructure and related military systems. That is why one quote from General Dan Kane fits this phase of the war so well. He said the early campaign was designed to daze and confuse them. And that is exactly what these strikes look like in practice. The first wave was not only meant to destroy visible targets, it was meant to fracture the system, so that every launcher or radar that survived would still be operating in a more chaotic, less protected environment than before. And once that starts happening, air power becomes far more dangerous. Reuters reported that the early U.S. and Israeli strikes helped establish air superiority over Iran, while Israeli officials later said their air force had reached aerial superiority over Tehran itself. That lines up with the broader picture in the story, where repeated strikes continue hitting the capital, smoke keeps rising over key districts, and Iranian air defenses appear increasingly unable to stop manned aircraft from operating over some of the most sensitive parts of the country. This is also where the war becomes more destructive in a broader sense. The strikes on March 7 to 8 hit fuel depots and refineries around Tehran and neighboring Alborz, sending massive smoke plumes over a city of more than 9 million people. Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Esmail Baghai called it a dangerous new phase, while Israeli military spokesperson Nadav Shoshani defended the attacks by saying they are a legal military target. Those two lines capture the escalation perfectly. One side sees strategic fuel infrastructure as fair game, while the other sees those same strikes as proof the war is entering a much more dangerous stage. But even with all of that pressure, Iran still has one weapon it can continue using at scale. Iran may be able to produce around 10,000 drones per month. And that helps explain why officials in Washington have reportedly acknowledged that one-way attack drones are a bigger problem than expected. Iran is losing launchers, radar coverage, and protected airspace, but it is not losing the ability to keep creating danger. That is why the war is not winding down after these strikes. It is entering a new phase where one side may control more of the sky, while the other still has enough low-cost strike capacity to keep the region under constant pressure. Iran, meanwhile, is showing no sign that it intends to fold under pressure. That matters because once a government shifts from short war thinking to endurance thinking, every new strike starts carrying a different meaning. The issue is no longer whether Iran has taken serious losses, but whether those losses are actually forcing retreat or simply pushing Tehran deeper into a longer and harder war. So far, the signal from Tehran has been defiance. Iran's ambassador to the UN in Geneva ruled out talks with Washington for the time being and said, "For the time being, we are very doubtful about the usefulness of negotiation. The only language for talking with the United States is the language of defense." That fits the broader picture perfectly. Because even after waves of airstrikes, naval losses, and rising pressure on its launch infrastructure, Tehran is still signaling that it is preparing for resistance, not surrender. At the same time, the war is starting to brush directly against NATO territory. And that is where the danger rises sharply. Reuters reported that Turkey said a second Iranian ballistic missile was intercepted by NATO defenses after entering Turkish airspace, which instantly expands the significance of the conflict beyond the U.S. Iran-Israel triangle. Once missiles begin crossing into the airspace of a NATO member, this stops looking like a contained regional war and starts looking like a crisis that could pull in a much wider security architecture. That is why the political response matters almost as much as the interception itself. Turkish officials said the alliance had raised its missile defense posture, and NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte made the message even clearer when he said, "Our allies are not directly involved in this conflict, but they have to protect their territories, and that's exactly what they are doing." That line captures the new reality of this war, because the battlefield may still be centered on Iran and its immediate rivals, but the security consequences are already reaching the borders of the alliance. And that is the real danger now. Iran is signaling endurance, NATO is signaling readiness, and neither side is speaking the language of de-escalation. Once that happens in a battle space already crowded with aircraft, warships, drones, missile batteries, and commercial shipping, the room for miscalculation becomes dangerously small. At that point, escalation stops looking like an accident and starts looking like the natural direction of the war. What all of this adds up to is a conflict that is no longer moving in just one direction. At sea, Iran has taken severe losses, with the destruction of Dena, additional vessels burning near Hormuz, and reported naval losses climbing into the high teens. In the air, launchers, support vehicles, air defense systems, and military sites inside Iran are continuing to come under pressure, while repeated strikes around Tehran, Shiraz, and other key areas show that this campaign is not slowing down. And over all of it hangs the drone problem, because even after major losses, Iran still appears capable of sustaining pressure through cheaper, more numerous systems that are much harder to fully suppress. That is why this war now looks far more dangerous than it did at the start. The Strait of Hormuz has reportedly seen tanker traffic drop by 92%, shipping risk has surged, and the military burden is spreading outward as more naval and air defense assets are pulled into the crisis. At the same time, Iran is showing no sign of backing down, while NATO is already being forced to pay closer attention as the conflict edges nearer to alliance airspace and regional fault lines. This is no longer just a question of who landed the bigger strike in the last 12 or 24 hours. It is becoming a test of endurance, escalation control, and whether either side can absorb mounting military and economic pressure without pushing the region into something even bigger. And that is really the point to take away from all of this. What began as a series of dramatic strikes has turned into a layered conflict involving naval attrition, missile suppression, drone saturation, commercial disruption, and widening geopolitical risk. The battlefield is no longer confined to one port, one city, or one stretch of sea, because every new strike now connects to a larger chain reaction that hits shipping, energy, alliance security, and the balance of power across the region. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss our next report. We will continue tracking the biggest developments, the clearest signals, and the real strategic meaning behind the headlines as this war keeps evolving.